For decades, we've lived with a story that has become something of a myth. The idea that the Beatles, the greatest band in history, simply vanished in 1970. We're told the end began the moment Paul announced his departure, or perhaps the day Yoko Ono stepped into the recording studio. But what if those moments were merely the final act of a process that began long before the band even released their first record? The Beatles were four distinct worlds, held in a single orbit, not by comfort, but by the sheer gravity of their fame. And like any unbalanced orbit, they were destined to drift apart. In 1962, four young men from Liverpool signed a contract with EMI. They had no way of knowing that within 5 years, they would become a global phenomenon, symbols of an era and idols for generations. Yet, from day one, the harmony heard in their songs rarely reflected the friction behind the studio doors. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were two poles of an intense magnetic field. While they wrote together, they rarely agreed. John was aggressive, impulsive, and blunt. Paul was a structuralist, a melodic perfectionist. Between them stood George Harrison, a brilliant guitarist who never quite received the space he deserved. And then there was Ringo Starr, who arrived late to the party. Though he locked in perfectly on stage, in the creative room, he often found himself an observer. On their debut album, Please Please Me, 14 songs were recorded in less than 13 hours. Most were penned by Lennon and McCartney. Only one belonged to George. At the time, it seemed normal. But in the creative world, such an imbalance is a ticking time bomb. From the outside, their early albums sounded like pure sunshine. Lyrics of love, smiles, and sweet promises. But beneath those bright melodies lay shadows of competition and subtle barbs. Even when they shared a credit, John and Paul often wrote in isolation, comparing their work like rivals wrapped in harmony. As the albums progressed, their musical DNA began to diverge. John retreated into sharp existential wordplay, while Paul built cathedrals of radio-friendly melody. They weren't just growing, they were outgrowing each other. From the pop roots of Rubber Soul to the boundary-breaking Revolver and the psychedelic climax of Sgt. Pepper, their artistic paths were splintering. John became obsessed with the surreal, Paul with complex personal arrangements, George with Eastern spirituality. Meanwhile, Ringo began to fade from the sessions entirely. The Beatles had become four separate worlds, each carrying a sound and identity that no longer fit together. They changed the landscape of music forever, but the celebration masked a cold reality. They were no longer singing with one voice. To the public, Brian Epstein was just a manager. To the Beatles, he was the shield, the mediator who anchored four massive egos in one room. He managed the chaos, soothed the conflicts, and hid the cracks from the world. When Epstein died of an overdose on August 27, 1967, the band's collapse became inevitable. Without him, there was no one to bridge the gap between John and Paul, no one to advocate for George's rejected songs, and no one for Ringo to lean on. They later admitted that once Brian was gone, the collective vision died with him. In the wake of this loss, they founded AppleCore. Intended as a creative haven, it quickly became a symbol of unmanageable dysfunction. And as with every great collapse, the public went looking for a scapegoat. They found one in Yoko Ono. The media painted her as an interloper, but the truth was far more personal. Yoko came from the avant-garde world, a place of silence, performance art, and surrealism. For a John Lennon exhausted by the cage of fame, Yoko was the oxygen he had been gasping for. She offered him a world of radical politics and art that knew no boundaries. For the first time, an outsider sat in the inner sanctum of the studio. To Paul, Yoko represented John's withdrawal. John no longer wanted to be a Beatle. He wanted to be a free artist. Yoko didn't break the band. They were already fractured. But she gave John the honesty he needed to admit it. If creative differences started the fire, money and mistrust poured gasoline on it. Following Epstein's death, a power vacuum emerged, filled by two opposing forces, Alan Klein and Lee Eastman. Klein was a shark, a ruthless, charismatic manager who knew every loophole in the industry. Eastman was a sophisticated arts lawyer and, crucially, Paul McCartney's father-in-law. Paul pushed for Eastman, citing trust and family. The others saw it differently. John, George, and Ringo felt Paul was trying to seize total control. For the first time, the line was officially drawn. The Beatles were split 3-1. Every business meeting became a battlefield of royalties, copyrights, and suspicion. They hadn't run out of songs, they had run out of trust. If music was their soul, money was the wall, and that wall had grown too high to climb together. On April 10, 1970, Paul McCartney released an interview stating he was no longer working with the others. He never used the word breakup, but the world understood. Headlines screamed across every newspaper, "Paul quits the Beatles." John Lennon was furious, not because Paul left, but because Paul had claimed the narrative for himself. Months later, Paul filed a formal lawsuit in London's High Court to legally dissolve the partnership. It wasn't just a musical split, it was the legal execution of a dream. In less than a decade, the Beatles rewrote the definition of popular music. They changed the world not just through their craft, but through their honesty about love, war, and the pain of letting go. They started as 4 boys with guitars and a shared dream, but the world moved too fast. Chased by expectations and suffocated by the industry, they didn't fail because they lacked talent. They ended because they grew up, and they grew in different directions.